Welcome everyone. Fiona and I are here with William Thomson, and William runs the Scotonomics show. So William, really nice to have you, and congratulations on finishing your second master's degree. I think you finished it in December, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Marlene. Yeah, 3 years I've been studying. The first year I did a master's in the green economy, and the last 2 years I've been doing a master's in the economics of sustainability. So I just really felt that we were missing an understanding of how the climate and how the economy kind of connects. And you often see that economic situations just don't chime with what we need to do in terms of the ecological problems. And an understanding of that really, really helps us move forward. I think and much wider than, talking about Scottish independence alone, but I think it really helps us look into the future for talking about Scottish independence in a few years, while we're going to be hugely affected by the ecological crisis. So we kind of really need to know what's going on.
You just have to look at the TV and see what's happening in Los Angeles just now to see that, don't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Nearly 2 years ago, Fiona and we did a podcast with Tim Rideout and Ian Stewart of the Scottish Currency Group. And we came up with a set of questions for them. It was on the occasion when the ScotGov had just published one of their papers in support of independence, and it was the one on the economy. So as I say, nearly 2 years ago. So William, you got in touch with us a few months back and said, hey, those were really good questions, but I'd answer them a bit differently. How's about I come on and do it? So that's what we're here to do today.
I thought the questions were brilliant. I thought the Scottish Currency Group did a really good job of answering them, but 2 years is quite a long time. Yeah. And I did want to commend you for having questions that are still relevant 2 years later. So well done on that.
That's great. Thank you. So the first one, which was, can we afford to be independent? And I know, we could probably have a college terms course on that, answering that question. I've still got friends who won't vote for independence because they think we can't.
I think the first thing to consider is that when you're talking about afford, you really need to be talking about resources rather than money. And what often people think about is when they're thinking about, can you afford something, it comes down to money. But actually, when you're a government and if you have your own currency, then you're able to create that currency effectively. There is a magic money tree. You can create as much money as you want. So there's no particular financial constraint on that. If you produce too much of your own money, then it's likely to, all other things being equal, lead to inflation. So you're saying that Scotland, when it was independent, let's assume it has its own currency, it can afford anything that costs or that you can buy in the Scottish pound. It can afford anything, right? And this isn't really a big logical leap. If you print money and someone's charging you £10 for something, there's no limit. There's no reduction in your ability to purchase anything. So, if everything was priced in the McGregor and Halliday currency, right, and you could just print it, you could buy whatever you want. Now, this is a logical, and I don't think this is too challenging for people to kind of understand. That's the situation you're in if you create your own currency. So if it's in the Scottish pound, the Scottish government can afford to purchase it. Now, the Scottish government can also afford to pay anyone in the Scottish currency because, again, they're creating the currency. So let's take pensions as a really good example. If the pensions are paid in Scottish currency, which they would be, that's how every country that has its own currency pays its currencies. The process is very simple. The government says, Fiona and Marlene need the pension this week. Let's put money into their bank so that they can withdraw from the bank. Now, that's how every part of government spending works. Now, at no point is the government saying, I'm sorry, girls, we can't pay you because we haven't raised enough tax. Right? That's not how it works. The government spends money, it's obliged to pay your pension. So there's never any concern about any government with its own currency that's able to afford to pay social security or pay for things like government services in its own currency. So that idea of the government never being able to afford anything logically doesn't really make much sense, because it can afford to buy everything. Now, there's a concern that if you have a Scottish pound and it's not worth much, or it's not worth the same as the English pound, then you need more of your pounds to buy something equivalent that you're bringing in from another country. So that's a separate kind of situation. But in terms of the Scottish government being able to afford independence, if it's got its own currency, it can pay everything it wants now up until the point of it leading to inflation. The same for all government expenditure. Because I've kind of said out logically that a government can create as much money as possible so it can afford whatever it wants. That doesn't really make much sense when you go as a government, you go out to the country and you say, can we have 1,000 doctors, please? We've got the money for it, and you've only got 500 doctors. That's the concern. You're talking about the resources in the country. And let's also say things like, we want to plant 1 billion trees. Do we have the land for 1 billion trees? Yep, we've got the land, but we do have 1 billion saplings. Oh no, we don't. That's the problem, is finding the resources. So when we're thinking about Scotland and being independent, we really need to think about the resources that we have, the size of our population, the types of businesses that are here, the access to energy, renewable energy, minerals, all of these types of things are incredibly important. And another logical step is that right now we look out to Scotland and we see that we've got an abundance of resources. We've got more than enough resources to supply our own country. So what's the logical step from not being able to afford those resources because they're all here? So that's how I kind of address that. We need to talk about resources because Scotland can run and if the government can buy everything that's priced in the Scottish pound.
When people hear yourself or other folks saying, well, a government with its own currency can print its own money. Now that often raises fears in folk, isn't it? And people go, what about, 1930s Germany or something, Weimar Republic? But okay, you've acknowledged that there's limits to that, because if you go too far, it creates inflation.
You're right to raise that, but that's how every single country that has its own currency operates right now. That's what everyone does. So I'm not talking about just what happened in Venezuela or anywhere else. This is what happens in the UK and America and Europe to under a slightly different arrangement. But in Japan and Canada and Australia, all governments print money and spend it and then tax some of it back. And the reason that they're taxing it back is to account for the spending. You spend £100, you've got an idea that you need to account for that. You need to bring that £100 back in. So you tax 70% of it and you borrow 30% of it. These are just accounting measures. These are not economic measures. There is nothing wrong with the government spending £100 and taxing none of it back. It doesn't need that money to spend another pound. So there's a relationship that people have that thinks a purely economic one, and it's actually an accounting one. And this means that someone has decided that that's the best way to account for spending. It doesn't fund the spending. It's just a way to account for it. You can account for it a completely different way, which is to say that £100 that we spent, we're going to put that in another little spreadsheet somewhere within the government. Just call it money outstanding. And you've accounted for it. It doesn't have to be accounted by tax or borrowing. These are choices. These are situations. These are economic ideas. They're not any kind of economic fact. We've got an opportunity to do something very different.
But then you look at the newspaper, you look at the TV, you've got people like Rachel Reeves, they're talking about, we're having to pay this amount of money to service the debt, and we can't afford this, and we've had to make these difficult choices so that we can get hold of the economy. And it's a completely different language describing a completely different system. And I can see why people are going, well, there's a whole load of people they maybe haven't heard of are saying something they like the sound of. But then you've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying something different. Yeah,
and I think that's the frustration that a lot of people have with economics and economists. And what we all have to realise is that there's an economic opinion and economic ideas, and there isn't economic fact. And that's quite difficult. And I remember watching the referendum debate and on Question Time, and someone says, we just want the facts. Are we going to be poorer or richer off in the future? Right? And everyone in that audience wanted someone to say poorer or richer, right? But it's impossible for an economist to say that. If an economist says poorer or richer, they're lying. Any economist has got to say, well, it depends. And what I think is likely is because of X, Y, and Z. So there's a lot of kind of more general issues with economists. And I think that's why it's really important to try as best you can to kind of explain the process. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to look at who benefits from any system. So you look at the government, the system that we've got now, the economic system, who benefits from that? Is it the people who are already in positions of power? Yes. Is it the people who are the wealthiest in our society? Yes. Would they want to change the system that we've got? No. Who fits into that? very well established professors at university who are on hundreds of £1,000s a year, government ministers, MPs, huge amount of the establishment benefit from the way the economic system is structured at the moment. Now, what we are saying from an MMT or an ecological perspective, or a more broadly kind of heterodox perspective, is to look at the economy and say, actually, I think, and here's the evidence, that it works or can work very differently. And when it does, the benefits of that economy are spread much more evenly, and we have a much more fairer and better society. But what we're saying is we need a world that's much more fair and much more just. And if you look at an economic system, we'll explain why that's not happening right now, who benefits from it, and what the alternatives are. And finally, I think that we can explain real life situations far much better than the kind of orthodox mainstream can, because they rely on these abstract assumptions and also a lot of mathematical models. You might ask a question and they'll say, well, actually, I can show you mathematically why that's the case. And we'll say, well, we'll show you by looking at the fact that there's no shops on your high street, or wages are really low, or unemployment's actually a lot higher than people think it is. You know, so these are all the kind of different arguments that we take, which I think gives our perspective a lot more power when we can get in front of people to discuss it. So I completely understand the frustration, and I think people need to look at a system and think, well, who's benefiting from that? And if it's the people in power, then they've got to realise it's unlikely that that'll change. And what we are pushing forward is a better understanding of the economy, to enable us to change the system so it benefits more people in our society.
Yeah. That does clarify quite a lot. But what about the deficit? It's every year, GERS comes out and it says how many billion quid that Scotland owes. And again, that sort of feeds into people's fears. So how do you deal with that?
When we talk about a deficit, it's the difference between how much the government spends and how much it taxes back. Now that's the deficit. Okay. Now what I said was that's an irrelevant number because it's just someone's way of accounting for that. So the Scottish government spends 50 billion and taxes back 10 billion. There's a 40 billion deficit. Okay. And we got, right, okay. So what we could do is we just increase tax. So that matches 50 to 50. Then there's a balanced budget. But this is only accounting, remember. This is not economics. Only a certain part of the economic profession thinks this is a way that you should account for government spending. Now, you can't deny this. There is a deficit, but what we would say is it's materially irrelevant because it's simply a score count. You know, a lot of people say it's like going to a cricket match. And there's a board that's got the amount of runs up on it. That's where it is. That's what the government deficit is. It's the amount of money that's gone into the economy that's not yet been taxed back. So it's not a concern for the vast majority of heterodox economists that are away from the mainstream. So the figure for a government of, let's say, 5% deficit, this means that the government has put in 5% more money into the economy than it's taken out. Now, who's in the economy? Marlene, Fiona, who is in the economy?
Well, I am.
Exactly, right? We all are. So when the government spends more than it taxes back, our net wealth goes up. So inherently, with all other things being equal, inherently a government deficit is good for the private sector because it increases our net wealth. As soon as the government starts running a government surplus, where does the money come from?
Us.
Yeah, not you two specifically, right? But it comes from the private sector. And this is a huge, I mean, I'm sure some of the listeners will be aware that Clinton was one of the first presidents in America to run budget surpluses. And everyone was crying about how fantastic this was. A few years later, there was a financial crisis because this just basically put the burden onto the private sector. And as I've explained, when the private sector has £100 debt, it has to find £100. Whereas the government has a £100 deficit, it can print that money, it can fill that deficit. So a deficit is inherently a good thing with all other things being equal because it increases our net wealth.
That's a complete opposite from what the way it's presented in the papers and the media. It's presented as if there's a finite pot of money that will run out. Therefore, if we carry on spending more than we earn, say, as a country, even though it is taxed, you're not going to be able to pay for your services. And this sort of household budget explanation that has been around since Thatcher, I don't know how we shake people out of that, because it's so ingrained.
You were fairly specific there. You were talking about the private sectors, but are you including the public sector, like hospitals, schools?
Yeah. I don't particularly like the definition that's used, which is the private sector, or you can call it the non-government sector. It just basically means everyone apart from the government. And there's a third sector, which I think we'll touch on, which is the foreign sector. And so basically, with the money, if there's a deficit, there has to be a surplus somewhere, because there is an amount of money that's in the economy. It has to come from somewhere, and it can only come from three sources: it's the government, foreigners, or the non-government sector. So let's assume that Scotland becomes independent and trade is exactly the same as it is right now. There'll be a government deficit of X amount and a private or a non-government sector surplus of X amount. This is inherently a good thing, because what that means is the government is spending much needed money on the economy. So after 50, 60 years of the most appalling lack of infrastructure investment in our country, and we see it on the high streets, and we see it on the roads, and see it when we look at the bridges, a huge amount of money is needed to recapitalise Scotland, and to build and improve buildings, improve high streets, improve roads, improve infrastructure. Now, the only people that pay for that should be the government, and the government does that by creating new money. So I try and get around this when people say to me, the Scottish government will have a 10% budget deficit. And I say, absolutely, that's probably a minimum. It's more likely to have a 10 to 12.5% budget deficit, because we've got so much to catch up on, and you can expect that money to boost the private sector for a decade to try and get us back to our equivalent kind of European standards. So I think you tackle this head on by saying this is inherently a good thing.
Okay, that's really clear.
And what about the UK's debt? Are we still expecting to take a share?
The UK debt is the amount of money that the Treasury has spent into the British economy and not yet taxed back. Are we agreed under my definition?
I did think about that.
Yeah.
Not
Okay.
sure I quite got it.
Every debt has a credit. Agreed? I know you're not accountants, right? But you can't. It's impossible to have a debt without having a credit, right? When you lend Fiona 10 quid, it becomes an asset and it becomes a liability.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's an asset and a liability. Okay.
So the UK debt is an asset for the private sector in the UK. Are we still following me? You agree with that? It's impossible. If the government owes 1.3 trillion, it has to be an asset of 1.3 trillion for someone else.
But not necessarily in the UK.
If it's a foreign investment, you'd be correct, but it would still be a liability for someone.
Yeah.
So an asset for someone and a liability.
Yeah. Okay.
So when you're looking at the UK debt, it is a liability of the Bank of England, the Treasury, and an asset for the holders of the government debt. The majority is based in the UK. There's not a huge amount of foreign ownership of government bonds. It's mostly the UK. So that's what it is. So you're kind of saying these two things balance, right? So if Scotland steps away, these two things still balance. It's literally, I say, got nothing to do with us, because you can't take on someone else's liability, right? That's what it is. The UK government have released that money, and they've got a liability. Now, the UK government could tax that amount back, and its liability would be zero. So Scotland just walks away from that and starts its own liabilities and its own assets, and it creates something completely different. So my recommendation is very clear. Scotland says, it's your asset. We walk away from anything outside of Scotland. It's not ours. Anything that's outside of Scotland, we don't want anything to do with. We're a country. We've got everything here, and we'll move forward from here. And there's a little bit on either side. You could be kind of horse trading, but people fundamentally misunderstand what the debt is. It's the UK's savings. If it's someone's debt, it's someone's savings. The UK, Scotland has no right being involved in this process. It can do that itself. And kind of finally, it's absolutely essential that Scotland is able to create, the Scottish Reserve Bank is able to create its own liabilities, because that's how you populate a monetary system. So it'd be impossible for the Scottish financial services sector to work if we've already got this huge lump of liabilities that we're expected to pay off. And my final point, the only way we can pay that off is with English pounds, which means the Scottish government and the Scottish population would have to earn English pounds. The government would have to take them or exchange them for Scottish pounds and pay this debt off. It's probably the singular most important thing that Scotland should not do as it becomes independent, is to take on any of the debt. And I've got to emphasise that in that paper that you were referencing in 2022 and the Sustainable Growth Commission, it says that Scotland will take a percentage of the debt. And this is the misunderstanding, a deep misunderstanding of how financial systems work and money creations work within the Scottish Government, which is something we are hoping to address this year.
But doesn't government borrowing create government debt?
In my mind, it's that the UK government has more or less said, oh, our cash flow this month, it's not looking so good. We need some more. For this month, we'll be borrowing X billion from the world markets. So to me, that's not releasing money, that's borrowing money. And yeah, then there's a liability there because you've got to pay it back at some point on presumably a set, an agreed interest rate. So is that, am I right thinking of it like that?
No, you're completely missing that first point, and that's understandable because this is where people are. The UK government doesn't spend other people's money. Every single penny it spends, it creates. Okay, so we spoke about taxation. It doesn't use taxes to pay for your pension. It creates brand new money, and the taxes account for it. Okay, are you there with me on the taxes side?
Yes, I understand the logic of it. I'm not quite sure I really can assent to it yet because it's such a kind of switch round on how one normally thinks. But I understand the logic of it, yeah.
So there's one paper that I'd love you to reference to the audience, which is an institutional analysis of the money creation in the UK, which was done by academics based at the UCL. And it explains that money is created by the government spending. So it kind of is a huge bit of evidence for the process that I've been explaining. But that's taxation. So government borrowing is exactly the same. At the end of the day, the government has spent, let's say it spent £1 billion. Okay, so it's paid £1 billion in pensions. Okay, and at the end of the day, it's actually only got 800 million back in taxation. Okay, so it leaves a gap of 200 million. Right, to account for that, and that's a really important point I need to get across to you, to account for that, it goes to the markets and it says, who would like to buy 200 million of government bonds? Okay, and then the market says, yep, we'll take that. And the market always takes it because you pay more on a bond than you do for the money that's in the reserve balance account at the central bank. And the government pays interest on money which is the reserve bank, so you pay more than they're getting, so it always sells. And all they're doing with that 200 million that they're borrowing is accounting for the spending. They're not borrowing it, they're swapping money that's in the reserve balance account, which is a form of money, for a government bond, which is another form of money. So they're swapping one asset for another. Borrowing is completely the wrong term, and it's only used as a way to ensure that people think that the government is like a household and it has to borrow from other important people.
So when it says they have to service the debt, that was a phrase I saw yesterday. That does give you that clear impression that you've borrowed from somebody else and you're having to pay interest to somebody else. So servicing the debt then, is that paying the interest on the bonds that we've issued? So is that paying ourselves back then?
No. So you've swapped 200 million, okay, Fiona? That 200 million you've got in your bank, right? You've swapped that which is in your cash account, and you've swapped it for a government bond, right? And the government says you'll get 5.5% interest on that government bond when it matures, right? So in a year's time, you get your 100 million back and your 5% on top of it. Now, that's the amount of money that we have to pay for borrowing costs, okay? But I'll take you back to an earlier point. Where does that 5% come from? How does the government come up with that 5%?
Prints it.
Absolutely. It's government spending. It just types into the bank account of the person who is giving them the bond back. It destroys the bond, which is a digital entry in a spreadsheet. It deletes 100 million and adds 105 million into their bank account. That's how government finances work. Okay, so that money will always be there. It's absolutely impossible for a government not to be able to pay the interest on its debt if it issues its own currency and that debt is in its own currency. Very different from euros or dollars, because government would have to exchange pounds, would have to find them. But when it's a British bond, the interest is always paid in pounds, and the government create that interest. So it's a made up problem. However, there's two important points I'd like to cover. One is that amount of interest is absolutely ginormous, and that is money that goes to the already wealthy. So round about 200, I think it's round about 200 billion over the last 18 months has been paid on interest on government debt. 200 billion has gone to the wealthiest, predominantly the wealthier and the wealthiest in society. And there's no cap on that. The government will always pay, as I said, it always can. But that's a huge amount of money that goes towards the wealthiest in society. It's ring-fenced, it will always be paid. But look at the other government expenditure on health, on social security, on education. These are the things that are cut back, but never the income for the wealthiest. And going right back to that question about, well, who benefits from the system? It's clear when you have this understanding that someone's borrowing money, people say, well, if they're borrowing it, they need to earn interest. But that's not what's happening. The whole system is designed to reward and enrich the already wealthy and the establishment in every major country. And when you understand that, and I think this MMT lens really helps, you understand that the economy is biased and is structured to the 99%, and government taxes and bonds and borrowing and debt are all there to confuse us. So
if I'm understanding again what you said is that then, you know, if it was Mr. Thomson who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you wouldn't be engaging in any of that. You would need a way of accounting for money that, you know, that say that 200 billion that you needed that month, but you just put that in a different part of the accounts. You wouldn't be issuing any Scottish government bonds. Is that right?
For simplicity, that's certainly an option.
Yeah.
And you do not have to release bonds, because you're only accounting for them in a way. So under that situation, you'd say, yes, we're 200 million short today. We just put that in another spreadsheet that's the, you know, rainy day fund or whatever. You just account for that, and then the next day you start at zero, because that's what happens with the UK government at the moment. All the government's money spent. At the end of the day, there's a positive. Sometimes there's a positive and we take it back more tax than we spend, but normally it's a negative. At the end of the day, there's a negative, so they borrow that money, so the next day they can start at zero. But all that's happening is that gap is just been accounted for. So I would be suggesting that's not how we should structure government finances. We should be accounting for that expenditure in another way.
That's really good. Not quite sure I've got my head around it, but that just actually seems such a more refreshing way of going about things. So
I think it's more logical. I genuinely do than the convoluted way that we've been persuaded. So I think there's a real ability and an ease to move people to that understanding because of the logical process. All they need to do is think that a government is not the same as them or a household. Everything I've said is not true for individuals or for companies. It's only true for the government, but it just happens that the government's the only body that can create its own currency.
Yeah. And so when you kind of also bring in the point that the way that it's being done at the moment, what that does is help the wealthy. I mean, it's presumably the folk who've got their money invested in these, hedge funds or whoever who buy up the bonds. That's just another adds to the kind of weight of your argument, I think, because that's quite a telling one, especially just now when we've got governments who seem to be remarkably reluctant to tax wealth.
I do want to add on one thing. I think it's really important, especially it comes back to Fiona's point about borrowing costs. The government has to pay 5% on the gilts that it's sold at the moment. Okay, who is it that you think decides the amount of money that the government has to pay on their interest?
I don't know. It might be a bidding setup where you go, I'll give you 100 billion, but you've got to give me 6%. And Fiona might go, oh, I could do it for 5.5%. Is it like that?
That's quite a good stab at it. But basically, it's the Bank of England that sets the interest rate. So it's a body of the government that sets the interest rate. It's a policy choice of the government sector the borrowing costs. And this is really important because Rachel Reeves is running around right now and everyone's saying you can't afford to pay the borrowing costs. And Rachel Reeves is saying, oh, let's cut 10 billion off disability benefits to do that. It's so ridiculous, but it's the government that sets that rate. So right now, the government could drop interest rates to 2%. It could instruct the Bank of England forcefully to do that. A couple of weeks, it could drop to 2%. And the interest rate that we would pay on all of our new government debt that was issued would be 2%. The government has that ability to do that right now, but it doesn't because of this whole institutional structure. So for someone like me who understands the economy really differently, this is the most infuriating thing that could possibly happen. Turn interest rates down and you'll have lower borrowing costs.
Do they understand that, though? Are they using this as a means of controlling the population and playing to the slightly right of centre middle class that they want to vote for them? Is it a cynical power ploy, or do they genuinely not understand the economy in the way that you've explained it?
Yeah, they absolutely do not understand the economy in the way that I've explained. I think that the vast majority of economic commentary that you hear is the way that Rachel Reeves believes and the way the BBC comments and everyone else covers. It's this orthodox mainstream view of the economy, but there's almost as many economists and certainly a lot more economic schools of thought who see the world a lot like we see it. Not everyone agrees with MMT understanding of the economy, so sees it a little bit differently, but most heterodox economists see that the government isn't constrained in the way that it pretends to be. And Rachel Reeves has basically said to the market, I think you've got loads of power. So what's the market going to do? It's going to take power.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. Now, if a new chancellor came in and said, you've got very little power, then it has very little power. And this is what's happening in Japan. And again, I really didn't want to layer loads of stuff on. But if you look at Japan right now, what they pay on government debt is nearly zero because they operate their economy very differently than we do.
In an independent Scotland, are they going to create an economy that works on the lines that you're describing, which to me seems to be the way that you get a more equal and a more prosperous society? Or are they going to be bound? Does Kate Forbes believe the same as Rachel Reeves?
Yes, she does.
How do we get out of that then?
Well, we've got a big job to educate right across Scotland, and that's what we're going to try and do in an enhanced mode this year with Scotonomics. I'm meeting some MSPs on Thursday. I'm meeting the Scottish Government Chief Economist on Thursday, and we're going to have conversations about some of the stuff we've been talking about, sectorial balances and government budgets and deficits and what impact that has. And there's other people having these conversations, and there's a lot of work going on. But Scotland, when it becomes independent again, has to make a decision. It has to say, how do we view the economy? What mission do we want? What goals? What are our values? And we need to find an economic structure that delivers that. Because right now, the economic structure that would deliver a Scotland that people want is not the one that this current administration thinks would deliver that. So it's a huge concern and a huge issue if we were pushing towards independence. At the moment, it's just a kind of almost a little bit trivial at the moment because it might be a new administration in a few years and they might have a clearer and better understanding. But it's a real concern at the moment.
So one of the things that often, even yet, gets thrown up by, a unionist point of view or mainstream media is, oh, Scotland goes independent, well, you'll be in for at least a decade of austerity. It's kind of got the point where you go, well, probably have a decade of austerity even if we don't get independent. But from what you said earlier about you definitely wouldn't want an independent Scotland to take any responsibility for any part of the UK debt. So probably, I'm thinking, there would be no reason for us to have any kind of a decade, long time of austerity. We'd be starting from scratch, as it were, and we would have our own assets here, some of which we can easily sell back to England.
Okay, what you're saying is not the case, unfortunately. You can't confuse a stock, which is an amount of debt, with a flow, which is the deficit. So the deficit is the thing that tops up the debt. Agreed? So if we start with zero, fantastic, we have zero. But on year one, if we spend more, or if the government spends more than taxes back, it has a deficit. So at the end of year one, Scotland will have a deficit. If everything was the same, and that's a fair assumption in the first 3 years of independence, that we spend round about what's being spent in Scotland by both governments at the moment. That's a fair assumption. And we also tax back, that's the same amount, fair assumption. And we sell and import and export the same, that's a fair assumption. You can't really argue with that in the first 3 years. Seismic change is not going to happen. Year one, Scotland would have a 10% deficit. Year two, a 10% deficit. Year three, 10% deficit. So after 3 years, we would have a debt that was equivalent to 30%. We would have a stock that's gradually building up, and at some point, it would be about 100%. So what we're saying is that if the Scottish Government comes in and doesn't spend the same amount, and it doesn't run a 10% government deficit, we will have austerity. It's impossible to define that any other way. If the government spends less than 10% deficit, then we will have austerity. So just to clarify that, right now, 10% more is being spent in Scotland as tax back. If the Scottish Government doesn't do that, we will have austerity because the money can't come from anywhere else. So my significant concern, and this is a conversation I'm going to have on Thursday, is that the current plan for the Scottish Government is to run a 3% deficit. And this is to align with the European Union sustainability, sort of the Stability and Growth Pact. The position for the Scottish Government right now, and they will say this, is that we will have a 3% government deficit. Right now, we're running a 10% government deficit. So if we drop to a 3%, that 7% of government spending must come from the private sector, which is austerity. So it's a really difficult position for the government to approach and argue at the moment. And that's my concern. If that's what they want to do, they've got to say to the Scottish population, this is what you're voting for when it comes from independence.
Is that whether you have a Scottish currency or not? If we've got our own currency, the bit about you just print what you need.
No, because that's where the deficit comes from. It doesn't
and the deficit
matter.
is the gap between what we tax and what we spend.
No, what the government spends and what it taxes back.
Yeah.
So if it's someone else's, if the government's borrowing that to spend it into the economy, in terms of this conversation, that's the same as if the government's printing it and spending it into the economy. There's no better situation if we print our own money because we still have a 10% deficit.
Is the problem then the arbitrary choice as to what amount of deficit is reasonable? Because if we say 10% deficit is not a bad thing, it means we're paying for decent services. 3% only comes about because that's what the EU's decided the level should be. And
Absolutely.
For us to get to that stage would cause us difficulties in terms of setting up a new country, which is going to cost a lot of money. So is it the fact that these things are made up anyway? And if we just said, right, we need 10%, in fact, we might need 20% for the first 3 years, get our institutions set up, and it's going to take us 3 years to get into the EU anyway, by which time maybe then we're in a position to do something about it. Is that feasible? Because I think the way that you're describing what you've just said about the first 10 years of austerity, if we meet the rules that the Scottish Government is likely to set on us, that is a very hard argument to sell in pursuit of independence.
Yeah, no one's going to buy that argument. This is what has to be made clear. And it's, I hope I'm making the case that Scotland runs a 10% deficit in year one, and that's a good thing. If we see our wealth increasing by 10% and that money is well spent, it's not wasted, it's not given to the already wealthy who go off and buy Ferraris, but it's spent on infrastructure and on kids' education and on better health. If that money's all spent, then we have a better society. It doesn't matter that we've got a 10% deficit. The concern is, and this is where it gets even more ridiculous, the concern is that we'll drop to 3% deficit rule and we'll lose that 7% of government spending. It will just disappear from our pockets. But the government is deciding to do that before we're even in Europe. So it's saying to Europe, look, we'll be really good, we'll be really great, we'll be, here's your apple, we'll be the best kids in the class, we'll have this limit even before they join. No one's asking us to. No one's expecting us to do that. And I genuinely think that no one in the Scottish Government has had this conversation with anyone at a senior level in Europe, because any economist would be looking at the Scottish economy and saying, well, you can't go to 3% because that would be worse than the crisis that happened in Greece. You can't do that. You wouldn't get accepted into the European Union if you'd stopped spending this amount of money on in your non-government sector for a period of time, because your economy would be an absolute mess. So these are deep structural problems that not only is the Scottish Government never been asked, it's never been addressed independently. And these are the issues that we've got to ensure are covered before we take a serious campaign to voters. And this gets to kind of the heart of what we're going to be working on this year. It doesn't matter if we have independence or not, it's the type of independence that we have. So if we become independent and we're still happy for foreign-owned access and ownership of our oil and gas and our renewables, then people in Scotland aren't going to be any wealthier. How would they be? The profit is still going to go offshore. So we have to completely change our approach to those who are extracting wealth from Scotland. This is non-neoliberal approach. This is what we have to expect a government to do if we want to see wealth. So we spoke about government debt and all of this stuff. We have to talk about where assets are owned and who owns those assets. And if we don't completely restructure the way the ownership of land and our resources in Scotland takes place, then we're going to be no better off. Independence is not enough. We have to take what's called an institutional approach to our economy and say, how do we view markets? What does our regulator do? How do we own land ownership? How can we prioritise communities' investment and engagement in assets? Who do we spend? Who does the government spend money with? Who does it spend it on? These are all things that have to be restructured. And when we looked at the most weighty perspective for Scottish independence, which was the Sustainable Growth Commission, it basically said Scotland will just start with all of these institutions and we'll gradually when we get round to it, we'll change. And that just means that Scotland would be a UK light or a tiny partner to the state that we've got right now. And I don't think anyone who will vote for independence wants that. But that's the challenge. We need a complete restructuring of everything in our economy. And that's why I think the view of people who are like me and have this heterodox approach to the economy can be really helpful, because we're radical. We know we understand what you're going to have to change to have a society that's backed by an economy that's powerful and works for the people. And an orthodox approach is just going to say we'll gradually get round to changing corporate governance or changing ownership. So
okay, that's really helpful. So I'm back on board now that I've heard what you said about it needing to be a radical restructuring, not just in terms of the actual resources we've got, but in the policies and how we run them. Yeah, great. Are you pro us getting back into the EU, or would EFTA work okay for us?
I think the first thing to say is that it's pretty clear now, and when the Scottish Currency Group spoke to you a couple of years ago, it was a different situation. And I think we're in a situation now that Europe is less of a kind of a la carte. If you're a new country, you're not able to say, actually, we'll take this bit, but we're not too keen on that. All the messaging that's coming out of Brussels right now is saying, if you want to be a new member, you join up to the currency union. It's as simple as that. Scotland, if it was to enter the European Union, would have to sign up to the euro. I can't say that categorically, but that's my firm belief. So I think that changes where we were 2 years ago. But the process is still the same. We have to have our own currency before we get to euro.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the same. That's the same situation we're in. So anyone who supports the euro, I often say, you might be right. Let's address this in 10 years' time when we've actually got that decision. But right now, Scotland can't have the pound. You can't have a non-European based currency to be a member. That's a rule. And you've got to have your own currency to prove that you can manage your own economy. And then if you can apply for Europe and the euro, which I think will be connected in 10, 15, 20 years time when we do it. So I think it's almost a bit of a moot conversation. And I want people to just focus on English pound or Scottish pound. That is it. Everything else is just for the future.
Yeah, okay. And the answer to those choices is Scottish pound, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And although, there's certainly support in independence movement for maybe going ahead and going for EFTA itself, although Iceland is about to have asked their population, do you want to stay in EFTA or go for the EU? It's thinking, well, maybe, EFTA ends up being Norway, Liechtenstein, Switzerland's a bit of an outlier anyway of both.
Look what's happening in America right now in terms of our new Trump administration and how he wants to redraw the map. It's almost just an academic conversation to be talking about what body will Scotland enter in, let's say 5 years' time, or 10 or 15. Who knows? I think these conversations are that's all they are. They're academic. I think until we get to that point, Europe is designed to support the largest economies, but those rules could change. And I think 10 years' time, trying to address the climate crisis, most European governments will be spending hundreds of billions of pounds more mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. It might be when we join that the average rate of deficit is 10%. Yeah. Or it could go the complete opposite way, and no one wants to join the EU because it's an absolute economic basket case. So,
yeah, and I suppose though, when you think about EFTA, you'd immediately have a set of trade deals in place. You wouldn't be having to go onto World Trade Organization rules. They've got their own trade association, and probably we'd be applying to join the EAA as well. So is that? That sounds to me like. Yeah. Whatever happened in the longer term, that would be a sensible thing to go for.
I would agree. I don't think any country the size of Scotland can.
Well, have you just agreed with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any country the size of Scotland can try and go alone. I think it has to find some trading partners. Trading with other organisations, other countries, is exceptionally important. But we can't define our independence by who our trade partners are. And look what's happened with Britain when they've tried to do that with Brexit. Yeah. It's just been an absolute disaster. And all that happens is they've lost a few billion in trade. It's much more than that. It's the cultural connections and significance and what you want to have these relations to do, which I think is much more powerful than just who do you sign up with, Yeah.
And there's also the issue that none of the candidate countries for the EU have thought, let's join EFTA. It's the EU is what they're all trying. And a lot of them are about the same size or smaller than Scotland. So
that's that's
true.
One of the final things I'd like to say is that what we've got to do, again, looking forward, is it's okay to look at Ireland and say that's good, and look at Norway and look at other countries, but everyone's institutional history and design is completely different. And what we have to do is start making the decisions when we look at our country now and what do we want it to become. And we have to kind of see the differences. And one of the things that I often kind of get a little bit frustrated with is people looking at, the success of Norway and saying, damn, if only we'd voted yes in 2014, we would be as wealthy as people in Norway. And I say that I would defend that and say that is categorically not true, because in 2014, we would have inherited an economic framework that's identical to what the UK has. And we would still have that. You need to structure your economic independence in a way to provide a well-being economy that's fairer and more just for everyone. You can't just say we'll do it like Norway or we'll do it like Ireland. So these are things we can take from, but that's not the case. If that happened, we wouldn't be in that situation. And being independent is exactly the same. We won't have this wealth simply because we're independent. It's all about the economic structure that we take into independence.
Yeah, but we need independence in order to change the economic structure, don't we?
If we had gone for yes in 2014, do you think this last 10 years we would have started to see some of the benefits coming through?
I think it would have been a challenging 10 years, but I think with that 10 years is a long time. But I actually wrote a report, or maybe an article, which maybe you can link to, and I covered this in detail. And I just basically said what would have happened, and I've just said that the 10 years wouldn't have been that much different. Maybe we would have had a few things which were much better, but inflation would have likely been the same amount, unemployment would have probably been the same amount, or GDP would have probably been the same amount, or kind of macro things. But at the level that I'm most interested in, which is at kind of micro level, I think we would have had more Scottish companies. I think we would have a higher living wage and a higher pension. I think there would have been a much more distributive effect on independence. But again, that depends. We keep electing Conservative with a small c SNP administrations. So are they actually going to be doing these things that we hope that they would do? And the evidence is that since 2014, and when we lost the referendum, all the administrations have still been centre, not left, but still been centre, still think that growth is the way that you provide for everyone in an economy, still think that reasonably low tax is how you develop. There's still a neoliberal administration. So I don't think the evidence supports that we would have been economically that much better off over that period. But culturally and politically and socially, that's the thing that I think transforms an economy. Being able to make these decisions, a reflourishing of Scottish culture, people feeling much more involved in the economy and society would be transformative.
Yeah. William, maybe you need to start thinking about standing for Holyrood at some point, and mind you, you'd have to have your own party as well to make it really left wing. And
you just set up a company. That's what Farage did.
No, don't say we're not going. No, we're not going to have that.
Can't imagine anyone would want me in their party. But it is a big thing, and I would say that I'm full time now on Scotonomics. I've only always done this part time while studying my full time masters. So the main focus for us this year is to do things like this, to get in front of more people, to say the economy can change. These are just people's opinions. You need to listen to other people. If you think this can be done, start supporting it, and going to the government. And we've got several papers planned this year, which are going to be really challenging for the Scottish Government's view of the economy. So any help in publishing and promoting the things that we do from you two, who I value so much, and also the audience, would be great.
Is there a website where people can look at some of these things?
Yeah, just our Scotonomics.scot website.
Yeah, it's a really good website, actually. Well worth having a peruse of. Actually, there's a load of stuff on it.
Well, of course, with our Festival of Economics only 10 weeks away. We're in Dundee again this year on the 21st and 22nd of March, and we have an event in Edinburgh, down in Leith actually, on the 20th, and then we've got our 2-day festival in Dundee. There's information on the website as well. We've got wonderful, as we try and do, brilliant speakers from across the UK, but also a few international speakers as well, and the vast majority of them support the type of economic framework that I've been discussing, this kind of heterodox approach. Not everyone supports an MMT understanding, but everyone thinks that we can run the economy in a very different way to benefit the 99% rather than the tiny percentage of people who do so well from how the economy is structured at the moment.
Great.
Fab. Okay, and you can get tickets for that on the website?
On the website, yes.
Fantastic.
Fab. Right, well, we'll put the links in the notes underneath this podcast as well, and recommend people go and have a look at the website and just see what's there. And I know you did a paper recently, I noticed, Byline Scotland, I saw your name against.
The paper that I've been pushing is a kind of institutional analysis of the UK economy and trying to explain to people, and we wrote this before the Labour administration came in, but trying to say to people that you cannot expect a new Westminster administration to do things completely differently, because they've got to operate within this institutional framework. And I've kind of explained what that framework is, what the values are, what the methodologies are. And when you see it, you kind of break it down. The only policies that come out of that are austerity policies. It's impossible to have wellbeing policies that come out of that. And the work that I'm doing this year is to say, and this is a conversation I had with a government minister, was to say, you need a completely different institutional framework from the one you've got at the moment if you want a wellbeing economy. And I don't think they realise that. So I'm working on what that institutional framework would actually look like, to be able to say, if you want a wellbeing economy, then this is how you deliver it. And this affects your social values, the things that you measure, what things you think are most important, what affects an economy. So a lot of work. Hopefully I'll be able to finish that by summer. But I think that's a really important point to make, is hopefully I've emphasised it a few times, that if we want the type of economy we want when we're independent, then there's no way we're going to get that with a kind of business as usual approach. We have to do something completely different. You cannot introduce wellbeing policies into the framework that the Scottish Government currently uses. That has to completely change if we want a wellbeing economy.
That just sounds great, actually. And if you do manage to get that into draft form or reasonable good form by summer, come back on and thanks very much for suggesting we do this in the first place, and
Nice.
then it's taken us a wee while to get a date for it. But yeah, thanks for coming on.
I'm going to have to go through the whole lot again and just make sure that I've understood it.
I think that's a really important point for me to finish on, though. It's really difficult when you're covering this stuff that's so different from what other people hear. And you can take two approaches, which is to dumb things down, or you can be really detailed in the hope that people will listen and pause and think about it and move forward and pause. And I know so many people who are in the independence movement that an hour's podcast like this might take them 2 or 3 hours to go through if they truly want to understand the difference that we have. So pause, repeat, and if you still don't know what I'm talking about, drop me a note via the website and I'll try my best to explain it.
That's great. Good.
Okay,
I'll leave it there. Great.